You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. With me today, my unusually well-informed guest is Dan Becker. Dan and I work together at York University. Dan's title is Instructional Designer and Developer. Dan helps faculty members in the Faculty of Education put together online courses. Today, Dan and I are discussing ways instructors can build engaging and rewarding online courses without workload burnout.
Ooh, yeah, that sounds
Dan,
good.
welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's my pleasure. So, one of the things that happened in the last 3 years is COVID. A lot of people will remember that. We're recording this in April 2023. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you have a very short memory. One of the consequences is that just about every course at York University went online.
Oh, yeah.
And so you were very busy. This is before I joined the same department as you, but I know what you went through. And one of the concerns, I'm sure, was faculty members saying, how am I supposed to go from teaching in person, which I'm very familiar with, and I have everything in place, to teaching online? What's the workload going to be like? How did you address that with them to make sure it was manageable?
Well, it's interesting because leading up to our big shift going from just the way things were to this whole new online thing, that happened all within a couple of weeks. And so the dean had come to me and said, hey, we're going to need to make a real serious change here. What do you think? Like, what are we going to do about this? And fortunately for me at that time, I had been doing a job where my main focus was to be able to talk with all of the different faculty members and move them in close to me so that I could help them individually move their practice forward just a little bit using technology. So by the time the dean came to me and said, hey Dan, what are we going to do about this? I had already developed little pieces of courses with almost every faculty member. So I had built a rapport with the faculty members, and I understood where they were coming from and what kind of their next steps were going to be. And the focus for me always was like, let's just take this one little bit forward. If every year we can move 2% better use of technology just in general, most of the time it was just learning management system issues. I sold it to everybody based on the fact that I said, if you give me 30 minutes of your time, I'll save you at least 8 hours worth of work. And so because of that, everybody was signing up. They were like, okay, great. When am I going to be able to sit down with you? Because faculty members are always very busy and they want to be able to do things efficiently. And so I offered that efficiency model to them. So then when we had to go and switch everything over to online, I knew exactly where everybody was, and I think in their journey. And I think the big thing with teaching anything is that you need to know where people are starting from in order to be able to get them to go somewhere. And so I knew the starting point for all of these different individual faculty members. And so then when we had to move it online, there was a certain level of trust already that had been built. And I think that you really need that because when you're moving over from face-to-face to online, it's inherently scary. And people go, oh no, what am I going to do? They're always worried, obviously, that they're going to do a horrible job. And they don't want to do a horrible job because these are, top shelf educators, people who really know what they're doing and have been at the top of their game for a while. But this whole change of modality was something that was obviously going to be very scary. So for me to be able to say to these people, listen, we're in this together. I'm here to show you what we can do in order to make this doable. And so I already had that buy-in from almost everybody. And I think of the whole faculty, there were only 2 people that I hadn't built courses partially or fully with as of yet, but I also had developed a very simplified asynchronous online model that I had been using for a couple of courses with quite a great deal of success. And so everybody knew that I could do it. And so then when I said, we're going to have to do this, there was a lot of people going, oh God, what are we going to do about this? But at the same time, they also were very interested in listening to what I had to say because they knew that in the past I hadn't really done them wrong. And when I said, I will save you 8 hours of work, that I wasn't just joking, that 8 hours was a conservative estimate. And I gave people back their weekends and stuff like that because of some of the efficiency measures that I was able to help them with. So I think moving from the face-to-face or some of the the different kinds of courses that were going on to fully online, it was difficult, but it wasn't as difficult as it would have been if I wouldn't have set that foundational information or those relationships up in the years prior.
Yeah, I like that. So it's almost like people have only ever written a paragraph or two in Word, but at least they knew how to start the computer. They knew how to open a file in Word. They knew how to save the file in Word. Now it's just, instead of one paragraph, it's a whole lot of paragraphs, but you got the foundational stuff in place.
Yeah, and so I think with that, when people were going into it, it's interesting because what I was the techniques that I was using to help get all of the faculty members going on this was the same techniques that we use just in the Faculty of Education for teaching. Like it's just good teaching. And I think once the instructors they didn't always at first realize it, but then once we started getting into it, they were like, okay, I see where you're going with this. And so one of them is the idea of choice. And I love being able to give out, like when it comes to you're asking a question in a course, are you going to ask them one question and everybody answers the same question? Or are you going to give them a couple of different questions and they can kind of choose from there? So I had for them a model that was asynchronous, and I had certain individuals at the faculty who were really good with the asynchronous online model. And so, and they weren't afraid to show people, this is what I'm doing in the online environment asynchronously. And then there were other people who were doing a different version where it wasn't completely asynchronous. There were some synchronous elements to it. And so then I said, for other people, well, and here's another version of this. Like, if we're going to be doing all online, we could do asynchronous or we can do a version of synchronous. Like, which one do you gravitate towards? And then the great part is with that, people feel, I got a choice now. So then, it's almost like when you have a restaurant where there's only it's not the, it's not the 45-page book of a menu. It's like 3 things. And when you have 3 things on a menu, you can pick out which one you want, just like that, because you got to have a couple of choices, but it's not daunting. So when I gave them a couple of choices, then people would know very clearly, oh, definitely, I want this. But then they felt good about it because they were saying, I would prefer to do this synchronous thing. It more resonates with me, or the asynchronous thing. They're like, oh, that resonates with me. But then all of a sudden I have some initial buy-in because I've started off with a choice.
So let's put some detail on that. So one of the things we should mention is that we're talking about Moodle typically, or completely. Did anybody teach without Moodle?
No,
so it was Moodle. It was Moodle that people were using. So when I say Word, it's not Word, but the idea that you need to, if you have the foundation of being able to put anything in Moodle, you're in a much better position for the next whatever reason you want to go online, because at least you know how to get in. But you've used a couple of terms there, synchronous and asynchronous. And the other thing that York did that I found interesting is it drew a line between what they called remote instruction and online courses. And remote instruction was kind of like you're still the prof delivering a lecture, but it's during class time. The difference is you're looking at a piece of glass with the faculty member on it, as opposed to being there in person. Whereas asynchronous is tune in anytime you want. There's some real structure to it. Things are broken up into bite-sized pieces. Did the Faculty of Education look at things that way, or was it typically just like you were driving towards asynchronous delivery and really thinking through how to parcel out the information?
Well, the great part is that if you make an asynchronous course, then it can be made into asynchronous very easy. And so for me to focus on the asynchronous, like the way in which the asynchronous is just organization. It's just a case of organizing things in a way that has a routine and that it makes sense. And then to be able to take the asynchronous model and just add a Zoom lecture to it, then all of a sudden it's synchronous. So you can have, because in the background, students have to receive readings, or they have to watch a video, or there's like some content that's coming in, and then there's other content that's going out from the students. So then the professor has to receive stuff. So then there's the whole motion of input output from the professor and from the students. That's asynchronous and synchronous is happening. It's the same tools that's happening. It's just a case of how are you going to be delivering the content. And some people feel it was like, if there were these courses that you needed to be somewhere at a specific time, then that would be considered something that was synchronous. But how much synchronous exactly was going on with that? Like, did they want to lecture for the full 3 hours? It was a 3-hour Zoom call, or were they going to do something smaller and then have more activities based around it? And that's really I don't think that there was any policing going on when it comes to that, because these are all professionals and they all are very good at teaching. And it's a case of how much do they need to be able to give out before they can get to the things where the students can then start working with some of these topics.
You said something earlier that I think is really important, and that is that it's just good teaching. And in that vein, I want to pick up on a paper that was written in 1987 by educational researcher Arthur Chickering and American sociologist Zelda Gamson. The article was titled 7 Principles of Good Practice in Undergraduate Education. And this article came up a few times. I came across it a few times in my travels alongside people who help people teach online. And of course, it was written in 1987. It was really about the in-class experience. But it served to highlight a bunch of categories of things you really need to be mindful of when you're teaching online. Because when you're teaching online, you do begin with a feeling of disconnection. You're talking to a computer and not to a person. You're typing things into a computer, not for display to a student, not writing on a chalkboard or whatever. And so you lose a lot of the natural rhythms and cues. And so it's good to have a list of things you need to restore online. So I'd like to sort of go through that list of 7 principles and get your vibe on how we can reproduce that online.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk.
So the first one is one of the characteristics or principles they have is creating contact between student and faculty. This idea that, especially during COVID, oh my God, everybody's stuck at home, and now you're stuck trying to relate to a faculty member who's on the screen. What conscious efforts can a faculty member take to construct connections with their students directly?
Well, I think, it's interesting when you talk about this from like something that's before internet. There's also another article that has to do with interaction that I always come back to that's from Moore in the 80s. And that's something that I've actually, when it comes to these principles, it reminds me of this because it's the principles of interaction, like the instructor to the student, the student to the content, and the students with each other. And then later on, there was a fourth one that was put in that that the interface was the other one, that they would both interact with the interface. But this is something where when you're talking about interaction, this is like the first piece of interaction. And I think, you want to have these pieces of interaction, but I see it kind of like if there's 4 types of interaction, I see it kind of like a wheel. And so the more that you're able to balance out the different types of interaction, the faster the wheel spins. And this is something that, and that's kind of how I picture this in my head, because the problem is with a lot of courses that the wheel is lopsided. So it's all instructor. Like the instructor is just like, it's just going to be a lecture series, and I'm going to be the instructor. I'm just going to talk at you for 3 hours. And the students just sit there and go like this. And you're like, okay, now what? Or they were like, oh, you were supposed to have read the content, but maybe you didn't, or we'll never know because I'm just going to talk at you this whole time. And so having a situation where you balance out that the interactions was something that was a little bit out there for some of these professors. But I think once you see it work, then it's a case of, you're not actually making space for something. You're actually trying to balance it out into to make the wheel spin faster. So then it really boils down to, how are you going to organize the course, and how is the course going to be, turn into a pattern? Because as human beings, we love patterns, and we slide into patterns consciously or subconsciously because it's comfortable. And that's why daylight savings time is so brutal, because you're like, I just got used to, I've been sleeping, and now I have to wake up at a different time. This is brutal. And it's like an hour. It's really only an hour's difference, but it's brutal on you because we just get used to these routines. So we want to set up these routines in these classes, and the routines have to have a situation where there needs to be content that goes out to the students, and the students need to be able to take in that content, but then there needs to be some way to be able to check that they've been doing this. And so then you have something that shows up where the students have to talk amongst each other, and then you have students, so it's student and content, and then you have students with other students, and having a situation so we did a lot of discussion forums to kick things off as a form of light formative assessment. And so, but then the instructor would look at these discussion forums, and they would then have a very good idea as to what the students were talking about. And this was something that was so powerful, because if the professor doesn't show up and starts micromanaging the conversation, if the students just have this feeling that they're talking amongst themselves, there's all kinds of stuff that goes on that you would have no idea was going to happen until you just let it happen. It's almost like, I see it as if you're sitting at the kids' table and the adults are at the adults' table and the kids are having a conversation. If your uncle comes over and sits down with you, it changes. It's a whole different story, because now you have an adult here and it's no longer kids talk. Whereas, with the students, when they're talking amongst themselves, maybe there's some you have some guiding questions that they have to choose from, that they're making note of, or talking with each other, and they're putting it in a way that makes it so that each other can kind of understand it a little bit better, because there's generational differences, there's community differences. And so students, if they can put it in their own words in a casual sort of way, was a very powerful form of formative assessment. But then once the students have talked amongst themselves, then we have more content that shows up. So then but having lots of little formative assessments built into the cycle is something that's so wonderful, because the instructor can watch what the students are talking about. And generally there's going to be, with any class, there's going to be at least 3 or 4 things that are going to be every week you're going to talk about 3 or 4 different main ideas. And so maybe the first 2 things that you were going to be planning on saying that week, maybe in the light discussion, the students are yeah, we get this, and you can tell by just reading what they're having to say that they get it. And maybe the 4th one, they also get that too. And you're wow, I had no idea that in another class they may have talked about this before. But then there's that one right in the middle that you can drive a truck through that is something that nobody has any idea about. And then you go, yeah, that's the ticket. And then the instructor will go right in. And so then they'll modify what they're doing that week based on what it was that they saw happen with the formative assessment. So really formative assessment is driving the instruction, but it actually just makes your engagement goes way up, because you're not talking over the students, or you're not talking under them. You're just hitting them right in the numbers, and the students really respond to that. And having that whole piece where there's that built-in flexibility, that's something that can be done in the asynchronous model or in the synchronous model, but it just makes it so that it's way more entertaining for the professor to teach, because the students are never bored, because you're talking right at them. And then also it makes it so that in the routine, I make it so that each week is something that, in Moodle, we have topics, and I just make sure that the faculty don't release the next topic until it's time for that next topic. So it's all hidden. So you know what you're going to be doing, but you don't know all of the specifics, and you kind of know you have the readings all lined up, but when you see the formative assessments, once they start rolling in and you're looking at them, then you say, oh, we're going to take this one out because they actually already know this, but I'm going to put something else in that kind of shores up the difference. And the distance that you get is way further with that. And then finally with that, like after you have, so you have the formative piece, the students are talking amongst themselves, then you have some more resources that show up, and then you have the instructor piece that comes in. And so would they do a mini lecture? Would they do a full-on 3-hour number? Would they have a guest speaker come in, obviously virtually? There's all those different things. But then finally, at the end of this week, at the end of this 1 week, if it was a 1 week cycle, then they'd have something that the students would have to hand in. That would be something that would be a synthesis piece that would have to do with, the objectives of the course. But then the professor can do one-on-one, giving them feedback. And that feedback is like where the really powerful piece is for the instructor to really get to know who these are as individuals. And so that sort of pattern would be a 1 week pattern. But I've also seen 2 week patterns, like when it comes to how the pattern goes. But I think when it comes down to all of this, the big idea is that it's about balancing out the types of interaction, and it's about coming up with a routine that is, like I like to say, rinse and repeat, like what it says on a shampoo bottle, because it's just, you're doing the same thing every week. But the pattern usually a pattern will cause students to calm right down. Mm-hmm. And it also helps to form community because they know what's coming up next. What exactly they have to do changes slightly week to week. But the pattern of how long do you have to show up? How long are the readings going to be? Like, what's going to be expected of my output? Like, how much do I have to take in? How much do I have to put out? Like, all of those different things are very similar as weeks go by. But because of that, we found that students, when they become much calmer, and when they calm down because of this routine, then all of a sudden creativity and community shows up because they feel as though I've got this. And the only thing that's difficult is just doing the readings and figuring out what's going on in this course.
So you use the analogy of a dinner party, or at least a dinner get-together, and it strikes me that there is some use for that analogy to sort of say, if you're the faculty member and you've invited everybody over, you don't have to do all the talking, and everybody doesn't have to talk to you. That nevertheless, you have a responsibility as a host to sort of get the conversation started. So, like, did you know Dan grows his own tomatoes? And all of a sudden, that conversation is going.
And then it just goes.
So you're obliged to sort of create that environment where people are talking to one another productively. But I think, especially a new professor might feel a lot of pressure to be the one who's constantly delivering. And there's value to that connection between people that I think is really important. You covered a lot of waterfront with that answer, because you've talked a little bit about the importance of routine, and there's this balance between routine and novelty that you need to strike, because if everything's just new, it's a cacophonous. Like, a lot of people are going to get lost.
Yeah.
So knowing what's going to happen, but not necessarily knowing what we're going to learn that day, I think is useful. But there are a few other principles in here. So you've talked about contact between students and faculty a little bit. You've also talked about the importance of connection between students. Let's talk about active learning. What's your definition of active learning, and how would a professor promote that in their classroom, whether it's online or in person?
Well, I think active learning is just a process of attaching new things onto what you already know. And I think if you're going to be trying to support active learning, you need the students to be able to it starts off always, for me, it always starts off with a choice. You say, here are a couple of different directions that we can go from this main idea, or entry points into this idea. Which one would you like to take? And then I'm a big fan of the community of inquiry, like the inquiry model, where I'm a big fan of professors not saying as many statements, but just asking questions. And I find that if you ask the right questions, students will really dig to get the answers. But the other piece that I can't ever separate out of it is the idea of audience, of the power of audience. Students will hand in to their professor bag of toys assignments where you go, well, did you even, like, what is this? And so professors do get upset, and they say, well, oh God, like, look at this. And so the students are generally comfortable handing in something that could or may not pass to their professor, but they definitely will never look dumb in front of their peers. And so if all of a sudden, like, that's the other balancing part. Like, how much is it that's going to be done publicly, like amongst the class, and how much of it is going to be done like just privately with the professor? And I think that there are different questions to ask for each of those, but I think having a situation where you don't harness the power of audience, that's a major problem, because I think with audience, like students dig so deep when they know that other people, the more people that will see it, the better products that you'll get. But the problem is that it's obviously it's very active on their part. The problem is with that is that it's very tiring, because you have to hit the afterburner so hard in order to be able to produce like this high quality product. If you have everything that everything is subject to your peers' scrutiny, that gets to be quite hard on you. And so then eventually it gets to the point where people, like, you want to be able to challenge people, and you want it to be uncomfortable, because learning is inherently an uncomfortable process, but you don't want it to be so uncomfortable that they're like, yeah, enough. That's a little bit of Vygotsky. 1978. That's the zone of proximal development.
Okay.
But the zone of proximal development is something that if you are trying to learn something and you have a feeling of discomfort, then that's what learning feels like. And it's really funny when you mention that to professors when they're like when I'm sitting across the desk from somebody and they're looking at me and they are notably uncomfortable and they're like, oh boy, this stinks. And I'm like, yeah, you know what Vygotsky would say about that? And they'd be like, don't you get me started about that. Like, because it really is like, that's the feeling, that discomfort is what you're going for, but you really don't, but it's a very delicate balance between discomfort and people just saying, yeah, enough, I'm done.
He was played for the Yankees, right?
Dodgers.
Okay. Inside baseball, people. So this is I gather a luminary in the studies of studies.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that you learn it's something that you learn as in your undergrad but they teach it, and so I think it's funny because sometimes you teach something for so long, but you need to be reminded of it somehow. And it was great to have a situation where professors were in a position of discomfort trying to learn this new thing, but so many of them, they're almost all just like lifelong intense learners, mm-hmm. And so they dig into this stuff really, really well. But that's why I think we were so successful in the end, because really, like, the way that I'm showing them how to do this is the exact same way that we're trying to get our teacher candidates to learn things and how we want them to teach kids then later, So it's all kind of the same stuff. And I think that they recognize that off the bat. So that's why it was a little bit easier for me.
So my son is 18. He's going to what I will leave as an unnamed post-secondary education outfit. And one of his great frustrations is not getting timely feedback on assignments. And of course, when it comes to workload, this kind of pits the interests of the faculty member against that of the student, because it's a lot of work if you've got 100 students to return 100 assignments with thoughtful feedback. I'm sure you've encountered this difficulty, and faculty members you advise have encountered this difficulty. What do you do about that to square the circle?
Well, the big one is getting away from the whole idea of the essay. Like, I think that essays are, I mean, I guess if you're teaching a course on how to write an essay, that would work. But I just don't think that it's just kind of antiquated. And I think the problem is that it takes you, if you say, hey, hand me in a 5-page paper, you got to read a 5-page paper. And then you have to be able to make comments on it that are sufficient to cover the different things that happen in a 5-page paper. So I would say that instead of doing you're not going to be able to get major feedback in a timely manner if you have to read 5-page papers from, our courses are normally 50 students. If it's 50 students times 5 pages, I mean, it's a heck of a lot of reading. So no wonder they don't get them back too fast. However, if you have something where I'm a bigger fan of having a situation where you give them a couple of different, that whole choice thing again, you give them a couple of different questions and then you say, I would like this to be in 1 page, or, you instead of doing one big 10-pager, 3/4 of the way through the course, you do a few different smaller papers that you can digest just by you can skim through it, get the idea of it. Did they get it or did they not? It's not about APA style. You're not dinging people on like, did you use the right, like, did you put the colon in the right spot and things like that. It's more just a case of here's a couple of questions that we're going to get different entry points in, and then like tell me what you think about this. Like, let's connect the dots on this. And the students are able to connect those dots. But the more you do when it comes to like lighter assessments, it's very easy to be able to get the feedback back to them. But that feedback is something that is not just for the students, it's also for the professor, because the professor then, instead of having a situation like, like a final exam at the end of a course, who cares about that? Like after it's done, you're not going to like...
There's no recovery.
Yeah, nobody's learning from that because you did horrible on it. So I guess that you just got horrible. Like it's way better to be able to have a situation where you can actually make adjustments as the course goes on, and then you can hit more people, with learning that actually is real for them, instead of just having something that you think, maybe 6 months ago you thought this would be a great question, then you ask it. It's a way better idea to see kind of where the course has been going, and then have the freedom to be able to modify some of these questions to be able to really pull out some of the things that you want to see.
So one of the things I'm very proud of about York University and the Faculty of Education in particular is it really does embrace the idea of diversity in people. And that is reflected not just in various demographic things, but also in the diversity of how one delivers information, one processes information, produces information. The challenge with teaching online is that it's a very consistent medium, or it can be. It can be very sort of, you click here and it opens up 4 things. You do 1, 2, 3, 4 things, and it can be very sort of repetitive.
Yeah.
How and also sometimes it will make demands or not demands depending on whether it's video or audio or text. What's your advice to faculty members who want to be able to meet various students' needs online?
Well, I think, in the end, it always boils down to the students being able to choose. But then you say, well, what are they choosing exactly? And, you're giving them a few choices of things. But I think in the end, the main 2 choices are usually you have questions that you're asking because, there's always questions. So they have a choice with the questions. But then there's also the choice of modality, how they want to answer. And so with final assignments, that's where usually that's like the big piece at the end where the students have to be able to connect a whole bunch of different dots. But then it's a case of, well, what are you going to do with this afterwards? And like, how can we make this so that somebody can benefit after the course from this stuff? And so, maybe you want to have a situation where you want them to do a video where they're going to do a video about different aspects of the topic that spoke to them, or different like a problem and solution sort of style, or also to have ways to be able. So, as a professor, if I'm going to be making something, I would love to have a situation where the students are making things that will then be a resource for subsequent classes, because that's awesome. And I think if the students know that they're going to be adding to a body of work that will then carry on to the next class, that's the idea of audience again. And the idea of audience is so powerful that the students will bring their A game. And, the big problem always is, for professors, one of the pain points for them always is it's soul destroying having to grade a pile of stuff that's garbage. Like you look at this and you're like, why did nobody pick this up? And then they start getting really upset with things because obviously they feel that like they want to blame somebody. This is horrible. But I think, we can have a situation where in the end, if we do a lot of little assessments leading up to it, then the final piece is really going to be just a showcase of the stuff that they've learned, because you've done a lot of the corrective measures and the keeping, like getting people back on track. Like all of that's been happening throughout the semester. So you already kind of know what's going to happen at the end. It's not like make it or break it. Yeah. But then at the end, it's more of a celebration of like what we've learned. And then how are you going to show this celebration? And I think having modalities be flexible means that people can show up with some creativity, and you don't even know what kind of crazy creativity stuff the students have until you open it up and say, here's some of the things that you can do. Because people will show up with stuff that will blow your hair back. Like, you can even, like there was a story where it was like, they want to do interpretive dance. Like they want to be able to dance. Like, great. That is awesome. I don't know how you're going to do that, but if that's your thing and you really want to be able to dance your way through this, like I would say that's absolutely wonderful. But obviously you have to set up how we're going to know that this is the case. But I mean, I think having the freedom for the students to be able to show what they've learned in a way that they really resonate with, that's something that a final product could be something that really sticks with the students, and it actually can send them off in a certain direction because they're like, oh, I can do education and I can incorporate my passions outside of school into it. And I think if you've ever, like when you were in elementary school, I'm sure you had at least one teacher who like played the piano or played the guitar or something like that. And when they rocked that piano for a thing, everybody was just like, yeah, this is the best, because this person is bringing one of their passions from outside of school and they're infusing it into them as a teacher. And that just like students are just drawn to that. And I think if we can foster that sort, like that's like the real good stuff of teaching. And I think fostering that can start with some of these online classes, but maybe you don't even realize that this is something that you're starting, but it could be something where the students are, because they finally are let loose and they can do something that's really them.
So let me see if I can echo that to make sure I'm following. So a couple of lessons I derive from what you said is it's not a silver bullet, it's flexibility. Mm-hmm. The only way you can be flexible is if you get regular feedback, so you know which way you need to bend, mm-hmm. not to strain the analogy. And also that if you allow for different modes of expression, you can really allow some joy and variety into the classroom.
Yeah.
So that's terrific. We're almost out of time, but there's I think there's at least one question I really want to ask you. And that is, I know you don't advise students directly very often. You're more involved in the creation process. But what advice do you have for students who find themselves taking online courses? How can they thrive? Or put it a different way, what are the observations you have about students who do well and those who don't?
Well, I mean, the tough part about that is that there's no standard way that online courses are put together. Like there's such a variety. And like even within education, where it's been me and the individual faculty members making all these courses, there's still like there's a lot of leeway for them to do all kinds of stuff that, that they can do. And so there's just not a lot of homogeneity to the whole thing. However, if you were going, so there's not really like one thing I say, if you do this, you're all set. It's more a case of, I think that the biggest way that students can fail, and which is something that I've witnessed, is that they just think, oh, it's online, so let's not worry about it. And so they only show up in week 4 of a 6-week course, and they expect to be able to just do the whole thing retrospectively. Like if I just show up, I'll just show up like, whenever I feel like it, and I'll just go back and I'll just do the whole thing. Kind of like back in the days where you had like a VHS tape that you'd have to get from the library, and you could just see, oh, I'll just crush down all these VHS tapes in like one night and no problem, I got this. That's the way that you fail. So I think if you're going to get in there, I think the things that I say to students for success across the board is get in early and often. So as many days as you normally would be heading to school, you need to show up to the Moodle. You need to look what's going on. And I think usually professors are very good at keeping things organized, and there's an organizational system, so get used to it. Have a look around and see what's happening. There's going to be some course announcements. There's going to be a calendar that says when things are due. Like get in, have a look, and if you get in and say you're there 4 days a week, and if you just have a read through, if anybody's posting anything, just read what people are posting. Just participate. Even if you're not posting things, just read what other people are posting to get a feel for what's going on, and do the readings. Not surprisingly, if you do the readings, there's a better chance of success.
Well, I find that answer really illuminating for this reason. We've talked a lot about timely feedback, and which is two things. One is timely, like you have to be in there to be timely, and the feedback, you're not going to get feedback if you're not in the course for 6 weeks, right? It's impossible.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is look for the kids table, and it may not be official, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a Discord group. Sometimes it's just a bunch of people on the same text chat. Whatever it is, if you can be at the kids table, you're going to hear, when dessert is being served or whatever, you know?
You're going to get in on all
and
that.
You're going to get in on and sometimes you'll get warnings like, you'll suddenly realize that everybody at the kids table is talking about that assignment that you totally missed. And so you have time to recover. So yeah, if you can show some agency forming your own community or at least joining one, that's really key.
And there's also a way to be able to wrap this in for faculty members too. And I've done this for a bunch of courses. When you're dealing with, if you're going to be looking at it from the faculty side, when you're looking at your learning management system, whatever it is, when we're looking at Moodle, you think to yourself, well, okay, like I'm going to be setting this up in this sort of way. And it makes sense to you as the faculty member because you're like, this is just how it's going to go because you've thought about it. And when you look at it, that's what makes sense to you. But I found that it's very effective, especially with the big classes, to be able to have a tour, if you will, right at the beginning. And it can be written. It can be something that's verbal. It can be a video where you use whatever capture software to be able to show where things are. But I've done this to a great deal of success with, especially when you need to have a very structured routine, and you say to the students, you say, I'm going to need you to. I call it the 4 and 4. And so I say there's 4 things that you need to do, and you need to show up 4 days a week in order to do this for your typical online class. And so I would say that the number one, and this is like broken record stuff. It's stuff that we just do all the time. And the first one is like, check the course announcements, because most professors will use the course announcements like a week at a glance. Like, this is what's going on this week, everybody, keep up. And then there's going to be the calendar. Like, check out the calendar, because in the calendar, the due dates are on there, so you're not going to miss something. And usually it's glaringly obvious, like something's due on Friday, watch out. And number 3 is I generally will set up a frequently asked questions forum in every class. And this is something that instead of sending emails to the professor saying like, when's this due? How many pages is that? Like all that sort of minutia, you put that into the frequently asked questions section, and the idea of audience once again shows up, and students will not ask dumb questions in front of each other, but they'll ask you dumb questions every day of the week, and then on the weekends even more. But if you say, great, put it into the FAQ section, they just won't, because they're like, whoa, because students nowadays are really intimately familiar with digital permanency, and they don't want anything out there that will be something that will make them look bad like forever. And so then they're just very cautious with that. But it's surprising that it works really well. And that's usually what saves people 8 hours, just having them not get emails. So then that's the third one. And then the fourth one is I make sure that every topic as you're going along has a meaningful title, like this is what we're doing this week, and a date range. This is like to bookend it. Like, so like, like check your phone. What day is it today? Like check the date, because the date's on there. And if you look down and there's one with the date that's next week, we're not there yet because we're not in next week.
Right.
And so that whole thing, but to be able to say, you go here, you go there, you go here, like, that sort of thing is something that it seems really like it's like you're dumbing things down, but just that as a really basic foundation is wonderful. And then I've also seen a wonderful way to be able to check that by making them do a quiz afterwards. And just, we don't really like doing quizzes a lot because it's a bit cheesy, because it's multiple guess or whatever. And, but I think for you have a tour and then you have a multiple guess quiz where you say, how many times a week do you, after listening to this or reading this, how many times a week do you need to show up to Moodle? And it's like, and then, answer A, whenever I feel like it, I'm an adult. Answer B, twice a week, like, that sort of thing. But I think by keeping it kind of light and you put that right at the beginning, people are able to hit the ground running, and the course will be something that will be, it calms people down because they're like, oh, it's actually pretty easy. It's just 4 things. And I just got to show up 4 times a week. You're like, oh, okay, it becomes doable. And I think as soon as the students feel, oh, this is doable, because they can start to see how this routine is going to work, it's just like the power of routine calms people down, and then people will show up and they're ready to get into it.
So Dan, thank you for contributing your thoughts to the digital permanence. We are sitting in I think it's called the flexible space. Anyway, we are in the facilities of York University and the libraries. So if you are a faculty member in particular in the Faculty of Education, but actually in York University in general, depending on how we look, I'm sure we look terrific.
We're going to find out.
We're going to find out. And I recommend you check out this facility if you want to do recordings. There's also a soundproof booth here, so if you need really high quality audio, there's a location to do that. There's also a VR AV studio.
Oh, and the people who run it are very good at making sure you know what's going on. They completely go over everything, and I think that's like the nice York touch.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much for being on the show, Dan.
Well, my pleasure.
My guest today was Dan Becker. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.